What if I told you the deadliest weapon the United States deployed in Afghanistan wasn't a bomb, wasn't a drone, and officially didn't even exist? For years, the Pentagon fed the public the exact same story. They showed us a slow, conventional war, PowerPoint presentations, generals at podiums. But while the politicians were talking on TV, a shadow army of our absolute best, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and the Rangers, were building something terrifying in the dark. They called it the Machine. It was an ultra-classified, industrial-scale hunting operation. We are talking about 40 separate raids in a single night. A kill cycle so fast, so ruthless, and so brutally efficient, it literally drove enemy commanders insane. The regular army didn't understand it. The bureaucrats were terrified of it. And the enemy? They were dead before they even heard the helicopters. Today, we are ripping the top secret stamp right off the JSOC archives. I am going to reveal the shocking truth about how our boys turned the Afghan night into an absolute meat grinder. You are going to hear details the government never wanted leaked. How a single brilliant general threw out the rulebook. How the military stopped hunting men and started hunting signals. And how they created a psychological nightmare that paralyzed the Taliban from the inside out. Do not click away, because by the end of this video, you will discover the chilling insider truth about a classified protocol known only as F3EAD. You will see exactly how our operators became the undisputed gods of the night. You think you know how the war on terror was fought? You have no idea. Let's get into it. In the agonizing years immediately following the catastrophic events of September 11, 2001, the Joint Special Operations Command possessed the most extraordinary collection of tactical talent ever assembled on planet Earth. We are talking about the undisputed elite, the legendary operators of Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, who trained for decades to execute covert operations that mere mortals could not even comprehend. On a purely individual level, their technical prowess was absolutely unmatched by any conventional military force or insurgent network in existence anywhere in the world. Yet despite this overwhelming superiority in raw talent and firepower, the entire system was tragically paralyzed by an infuriating web of Washington bureaucracy and toxic interagency rivalry. The traditional military establishment treated critical intelligence like a delicate artifact, gathering it slowly, analyzing it obsessively in air-conditioned offices, and finally acting upon it only after an agonizing planning cycle measured in weeks. A high-value target would be spotted on a Monday, but the actual approval for a strike would not miraculously land on a commander's desk until the following Monday. By the time the assault helicopters finally spun up their rotors on a Wednesday, the elusive target had already moved, changed his phone number, and bragged to 12 different people about his spectacular escape from the Americans. The enemy was adapting in a matter of hours, while the greatest military superpower in human history was struggling to adapt in a matter of weeks. The terrifying reality was that the American machine was losing the campaign, bogged down by generals who operated at the sluggish, mind-numbing speed of a PowerPoint presentation. The boys in the field were utterly frustrated, watching their prey slip away night after night, because some suit thousands of miles away could not sign a piece of paper fast enough. But this agonizing cycle of bureaucratic failure was about to be violently shattered by a commander who treated normal military procedure as his ultimate enemy. Enter General Stanley McChrystal, a remarkably lean, famously sleep-deprived officer who took command of this struggling apparatus in the year 2003 and immediately realized the entire paradigm was fundamentally broken. McChrystal was an absolute force of nature who held his uncompromising planning meetings at 5 o'clock in the morning, fully expecting every single person in the room to have already been awake and aggressively working for at least 2 hours. What appalled this relentless general was not the quality of his operators on the ground, but the criminal speed at which their extraordinary talents were being wasted by an outdated process designed for the 20th century. He understood a chilling truth that the Pentagon establishment flatly refused to acknowledge. The conflict was not being lost in the dusty streets of Kabul, but in the sterile, disconnected space between the battlefield and the intelligence briefing rooms. The insurgents were moving vast networks of personnel and weapons at the speed of a simple phone call, and McChrystal set out to close that fatal gap with a single-minded ferocity that would change special operations forever. What this visionary general built over the subsequent years can only be described as a near-industrial counterterrorism factory of unprecedented, terrifying efficiency. Before his radical transformation took hold, the Joint Special Operations Command was conducting a mere 20 raids per month across the entire theater of operations. Within 18 astonishing months of his arrival, that pathetic number had skyrocketed to an unbelievable 300 raids per month, and the relentless tempo was only accelerating. This was no longer a traditional military campaign with seasonal offensives. It was a ruthless assembly line that accepted raw intelligence at one end and produced permanently neutralized targets at the other. At the absolute peak of this mechanical nightmare, the elite assault teams were conducting between 10 and 40 separate direct action missions in a single night, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without a single pause for breath. Yet the staggering volume of these nightly operations was merely the visible surface of a much darker and more brilliant tactical revolution. The true genius of this new era was an uncompromising methodology known internally as F3EAD, representing a sequence of words that completely reinvented the way covert operations were executed: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, and disseminate. In the old, sluggish days of conventional warfare, an assault was considered the grand finale of a long intelligence process where the operators simply did their job, secured the perimeter, and went home to rest. McChrystal completely inverted this outdated logic, turning the actual raid into the frantic middle of a continuous, never-ending cycle of data collection and immediate action. The very second an elite assault team breached a compound and neutralized the immediate threats, the intelligence-gathering phase ignited right there in the smoke-filled rooms while the dust was still settling. Highly trained operators moved systematically through the building, ripping apart drawers and tearing through pockets to secure absolutely anything that could possibly hold digital data. They bagged laptops, notebooks, flash drives, and the crucial SIM cards from every single mobile device in the building before the extraction helicopters even touched down to take them back to base. Brilliant intelligence analysts equipped with miniaturized digital forensics labs were literally waiting in the back of those very same Black Hawk helicopters, ready to plug in those captured hard drives and extract contact lists while the operators were still wiping the sweat from their faces. The raw data collected from a freshly cleared compound was processed during the short flight back to the forward operating base, instantly generating brand new target packages out of thin air. By the time those exhausted operators finished cleaning their weapons and reloading their magazines, the next mission was already meticulously planned, briefed, and ready for immediate execution. However, unleashing this devastating cycle of relentless operations required solving an impossible puzzle hidden deep within the unforgiving Afghan mountains. Finding these elusive shadow figures in a sprawling landscape of deep valleys, isolated mountain villages, and vast border regions was a problem of mind-boggling complexity that required a terrifyingly invasive solution. The revolutionary answer was something insiders ominously referred to as the unblinking eye, a layered, continuous intelligence collection network that blanketed the entire combat theater in completely invisible surveillance. While the general public was endlessly distracted by news stories about armed drones circling in the sky, the true magic was happening in the deeply classified realm of electronic signal interception. The Special Operations Command abruptly stopped wasting their time hunting for human faces in the dirt and began a massive, theater-wide hunt for the electronic devices sitting quietly in their pockets. A terrorist commander could easily grow a beard, change his clothes, use a fake name, or move to a completely different province under the cover of darkness to escape detection. What that same commander could never change, however, was the deeply ingrained way his illicit network communicated with its financiers, bomb makers, and loyal foot soldiers. Every single mobile phone, every hidden satellite handset, and every encrypted radio frequency left an invisible but entirely trackable trace bouncing through the atmosphere. Elite analysts, supported by the immense power of the National Security Agency, were mapping these electronic fingerprints 24 hours a day, building a monumental database that revealed the exact shape, hierarchy, and fatal vulnerability of the entire insurgent organization. This breathtakingly intrusive surveillance apparatus fed directly into a heavily classified bureaucratic reality known as the Joint Prioritized Effects List, a devastatingly precise catalog that contained the names, location patterns, and electronic signatures of over 2,000 active insurgent leaders by the end of the year 2009. What happened next turned this static digital spreadsheet into a self-feeding monster that drove the enemy leadership to the brink of absolute psychological collapse. The list was a living, breathing entity that escalated individuals from a low priority to a high priority, the moment a single, intercepted text message linked them to an upcoming operation. The sheer terror of this system was its beautifully self-reinforcing nature. Every time the elite operators removed a senior commander from the board, they created a desperate leadership vacuum that forced the enemy to scramble and hurriedly reorganize their ranks. That frantic reorganization inevitably required new phone calls to be made, which generated fresh signal intercepts, which instantly populated the database with brand new targets for the very next night of raids. The insurgents were tragically trapped in a catastrophic dynamic where their very attempts to recover from a devastating attack provided the exact intelligence the Americans needed to launch the next catastrophic blow. Running their networks made them spectacularly visible to the invisible eye, but going entirely silent made them completely useless to their own radical cause, leaving them with absolutely no moves that did not pull them deeper into the terrifying jaws of the machine. Imagine an arrogant insurgent commander operating in the treacherous mountains during the peak of the brutal conflict. He picked up his mobile device, made a brief tactical call to his underground network, and then calmly poured himself a hot cup of tea. He felt completely secure, resting comfortably in the absolute certainty of how the American military machine had traditionally operated for decades. Conventional military planning for a direct action mission required a massive minimum of 72 agonizing hours from the initial target identification to the final execution. Intelligence verification, exhausting mission planning, endless rehearsals, and sluggish approval chains up through the bureaucratic command structure took an enormous amount of precious time. During those 72 hours, a clever target could easily pack his bags, move his entire operation to a completely different province, and disappear entirely into the shadows. This arrogant commander believed he fully understood the strict rules of the deadly game he was playing against the foreign invaders. He thought that simple physical movement, strict communication discipline, and extreme network compartmentalization would easily protect his illicit enterprise from the clumsy American giants. What he completely failed to realize was that General Stanley McChrystal had utterly and violently destroyed that outdated, pathetic timeline. The Joint Special Operations Command had permanently compressed that 72-hour planning cycle into something so blindingly fast it defied basic human comprehension. But this impossible speed was merely the opening act of a much darker psychological game. At the absolute operational peak of the grueling Afghan campaign, the time between a single intercepted phone signal and the violent arrival of an elite assault team had been slashed to an astonishing window. The entire process had been miraculously reduced to less than 90 minutes from the very moment the target foolishly pressed the call button. From a simple signal intercept in the mountains to heavy boots forcefully kicking down a wooden door in exactly 90 minutes. The brilliant intelligence analysts who had to verify and package the target information were no longer sitting at distant headquarters, drinking terrible coffee. They were aggressively embedded right there with the tactical task forces, working with absolute urgency while the assault teams were literally already wearing their combat gear. The cumbersome approval chains had been violently streamlined to the point where a local task force commander could authorize a massive high-stakes strike without waiting for permission from the top brass in Kabul. The legendary Black Hawk helicopters were already pre-positioned on the dusty tarmac, fully fueled, heavily armed, and crewed by elite pilots on high alert around the clock. The highly trained assault teams maintained a grueling, rotating readiness posture where at least one devastating element was at a 30-minute launch notice at all hours of the day and night. So while our enemy commander was still finishing his evening tea, completely convinced he had 3 full days to relocate his operation, the operators were already in the air and closing in fast. He was confidently calculating his survival against an old, broken military machine that simply no longer existed in the real world. The terrifying new machine he was actually facing had been replaced by something infinitely faster, completely invisible, and utterly relentless in its pursuit. He thought he was playing a slow game of chess with a blind opponent, comfortably planning his next strategic move. And he absolutely did not know the shocking truth until the heavily armed helicopters violently landed right on his roof. Yet the physical removal of these oblivious targets was just the beginning of an even more sinister strategy. The brutal psychological dimension of these relentless night raids was never just an accidental byproduct of the intense tactical operations. It was, for the senior leadership of the Joint Special Operations Command, a deeply deliberate, highly calculated operational objective aimed at completely breaking the human mind. The elite operators specifically wanted to induce massive sleep disruption, absolute crippling paranoia, and the complete destruction of basic trust within the secretive insurgent networks. These devastating mental consequences were considered highly legitimate combat effects, entirely as real and as measurable as the physical neutralization of their most senior commanders. They were not just dismantling a military network, they were engineering a comprehensive psychological breakdown across the entire enemy organization. A radical commander operating in the violent valleys during the year 2009 lived in a specific psychological hell that has absolutely no parallel in the history of conventional warfare. He knew perfectly well that the unblinking American surveillance was persistent, calculating, and completely inescapable at any hour of the day or night. He knew that the silent, unmanned aircraft lingering ominously in the clouds overhead were not just passing through, but continuously circling, watching his every single move. He knew that every mobile device was actively being monitored, which meant that every single operational communication could easily become an immediate sentence of absolute tragedy. Every time he picked up a two-way radio, he was essentially painting a glowing, permanent target directly on his own back for the invisible hunters. But the absolute worst terror was the agonizing realization that the enemy was already inside his most trusted inner circle. He knew with chilling certainty that the loyal men standing right next to him could secretly be confidential sources for the shadowy intelligence agencies. This terrifying fact meant that the most dangerous threat to his continued survival might be sitting right there in his own private compound, quietly sharing his meals and passing him bread. He knew that the elite Americans almost always came under the heavy cover of absolute darkness, utilizing advanced night vision technology to completely dominate the shadows. This meant that the comforting darkness, which had historically served as a reliable protection for guerrilla forces for centuries, had been violently transformed into the terrifying period of his maximum vulnerability. The very night itself had been maliciously weaponized against him, turning every strange shadow and every rustling leaf into a harbinger of sudden doom. The devastating result of this relentless, suffocating pressure was a highly specific, crippling form of absolute operational paralysis. Commanders who miraculously managed to survive long enough to adapt began operating on communication cycles so heavily restricted that their ability to coordinate complex operations was severely degraded. They desperately abandoned their mobile phones and used slow human couriers instead, which tragically slowed their tactical decision cycle to a useless, agonizing crawl. They moved constantly and frantically from village to village, which completely exhausted their physical resources and utterly fractured their vital underground support networks. By aggressively compartmentalizing their operations and sharing vital information with almost nobody, they systematically destroyed the very organizational coherence that had previously made them an effective fighting force. Every single desperate adaptation they made to survive the terrifying tempo of the elite operators only made them significantly less capable of fighting the massive war they so desperately needed to fight. They were unknowingly doing the brutal work of the American military for them, tearing their own powerful networks apart out of sheer, unadulterated panic. The legendary invisible machine had successfully infected their minds, turning their own natural survival instincts into the very poison that would inevitably seal their tragic fate. This total psychological collapse was exactly the terrifying outcome the brilliant architects of the machine had flawlessly designed. The men who physically executed those 40 separate raids every single night were not merely highly trained soldiers following basic orders from their superiors. They were a completely different breed of human being, intentionally forged in a psychological furnace that would have completely destroyed a normal person's mind and body. The legendary 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, widely known by the public as Delta Force, traced its deeply classified origins back to the visionary military strategist Colonel Charles Beckwith. This uncompromising officer designed a brutal selection process built entirely on one terrifying core principle, testing a candidate's ability to think with absolute crystal clarity when every biological system in his body was screaming for mercy. During the infamous land navigation phase, exhausted candidates were forced to march entirely alone through treacherous mountainous terrain under the cover of absolute darkness, carrying aggressively heavy backpacks. Most of these elite applicants did not fail because their heavily taxed muscles finally gave out, or because their lungs stopped working in the incredibly thin mountain air. They failed because they experienced a complete and utter cognitive collapse when they were forced to solve incredibly complex navigational problems without a structured team to support their decisions. The shadow warriors who actually survived this agonizing selection process emerged with a unique psychological profile that allowed them to process overwhelming chaos as if it were a calm Sunday morning. For the heavily armed assaulters of Delta Force and the legendary SEAL Team 6, executing continuous high-stakes missions on zero sleep was absolutely never considered an exceptional or newsworthy event. It was simply their new normal, because the American military had deliberately selected men whose definition of a standard workday would be classified as absolute torture by anyone else on the planet. But the sheer physical toll of this classified operation concealed a much darker secret that the highest levels of the Pentagon desperately tried to hide from the public. While these Tier 1 operators grabbed the glamorous headlines and the attention of Hollywood producers, the devastating volume of this industrial hunting machine was actually powered by the relentless 75th Ranger Regiment. These incredibly aggressive young men provided the heavily armed assault forces for the massive volume of secondary raids that formed the actual backbone of the nightly targeting queue across the entire country. A standard Ranger battalion operating during the absolute peak of the Afghan campaign was sustaining a terrifying operational tempo that would have permanently broken a conventional infantry unit within a matter of weeks. It was not at all unusual for a single Ranger platoon to execute 4 to 6 intense combat missions every single week, week after week, without a single moment of genuine rest or recovery. They were the roaring engine of the entire methodology, proving that they could maintain absolute tactical perfection and precise intelligence collection across hundreds of consecutive, physically exhausting deployments. This massive disparity between the shadowy special operators and the conventional military forces sharing the exact same combat zones quickly bred an incredibly toxic atmosphere of professional jealousy and intense resentment. Regular infantry battalions, standard National Guard units, and conventional Army brigades dutifully operated on predictable deployment cycles and blindly followed painfully restrictive rules of engagement dictated by distant politicians. They deeply resented the sudden appearance of these secretive task forces in their designated areas, watching with burning frustration as bearded men with heavily modified weapons completely ignored the traditional chain of command. The elite operators possessed classified authorities that regular commanders could never obtain, acting upon highly sensitive intelligence that the conventional generals were strictly forbidden from ever seeing or discussing. These phantom warriors would suddenly arrive in the dead of night, neutralize a critical target, seize massive amounts of digital intelligence, and vanish completely before the regular troops even realized what had happened. Yet, the escalating friction between these two military worlds was about to be completely overshadowed by an unimaginable human cost that no one wanted to admit. The physical and emotional toll exacted upon the elite operators running this sophisticated machine at its absolute peak tempo was a subject of massive internal concern and deliberate official minimization. The dedicated operators from Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 were forcefully pushing the absolute limits of human endurance, operating far beyond any established medical or psychological model ever designed by military science. The standard combat deployment model of serving 6 to 9 months and then receiving a long, peaceful recovery period had been completely shredded, discarded, and thrown directly into the garbage. Instead, exhausted operators who deployed for 6 grueling months were returning to their families in the United States for a measly 60 days before being violently pulled back into the relentless meat grinder. Task force commanders secretly understood that they were rapidly draining a precious human reserve that could not be infinitely replenished, but the continuous intelligence flow simply demanded immediate, uninterrupted action. The highly classified targeting queue absolutely never emptied, and the fiercely time-sensitive nature of the electronic intercepts meant that a target identified today would be completely gone by tomorrow morning. Every single operator implicitly understood this terrifying reality, willingly sacrificing their own physical health and mental stability because they knew they were the only force capable of executing the dangerous mission. They strapped on their heavy body armor, boarded the matte black helicopters, and aggressively flew into the dangerous night simply because a target's mobile phone had briefly pinged a remote cell tower in Kandahar province. The horrifying efficiency of this massive counterterrorism machine was permanently and tragically inseparable from the massive personal cost paid by every single man who flew on those 40 raids per night. They were quietly trading their own sanity and long-term physical well-being to ensure that the enemy network was systematically dismantled piece by piece before it could strike again. However, this relentless pace was about to trigger an unimaginable psychological paradox that would permanently rewrite the fundamental rules of modern warfare. By the time the year 2009 rolled around, The classified targeting database had swelled to an absolutely staggering size, containing over 2,000 heavily monitored insurgent individuals. The nightly queue of actionable targets regularly exceeded the total number of available assault teams, meaning the massive intelligence apparatus was actually finding targets much faster than the military could physically eliminate them. Instead of accepting this massive logistical bottleneck as a natural limitation, the Special Operations Command aggressively refined its sophisticated targeting algorithms and drastically improved its intelligence fusion processes. The vast machine simply accelerated its already terrifying pace, responding to the immense pressure of its own target surplus by becoming significantly faster and undeniably more effective at removing threats. This hyper-accelerated environment gave birth to a deeply shocking operational reality that completely shattered the traditional understanding of how insurgent military organizations are supposed to function and survive. The system had finally reached such a terrifying level of absolute perfection that it inadvertently created a fatal trap for the most talented and dedicated members of the radical insurgent organization. In any traditional military conflict across human history, the most competent, highly active, and exceptionally intelligent commanders are naturally expected to survive the longest and eventually lead their forces to sweeping victories. But the brilliant architects of the American machine had completely inverted this fundamental evolutionary logic, transforming enemy competence into a glowing, undeniable signal for immediate and permanent neutralization. The better a Taliban commander performed his daily duties, the more he communicated with his vast network, and the more useful he became to his superiors, the faster his electronic signature was flagged. Tactical effectiveness had ironically become an absolute sentence of tragedy, ensuring that the brightest minds in the insurgency were precisely the ones who were violently removed from the active battlefield first. But the actual documented statistics behind this devastating paradox were even more chilling than anyone in the intelligence community could have possibly imagined. During a highly classified congressional hearing in Washington in the year 2011, a senior military intelligence official was gently forced to reveal the shocking truth about the massive network degradation. Portions of this incredibly sensitive testimony were later declassified, exposing a statistical reality that would have seemed like pure science fiction to a conventional military planner from the previous generation of warfare. The official explicitly confirmed that senior insurgent commanders were rapidly rotating through key leadership positions at a rate that made any kind of long-term organizational coherence completely and utterly impossible to maintain. Mid-level facilitators, deeply experienced logisticians, and highly skilled bomb network coordinators were being permanently neutralized much faster than the desperate insurgency could ever hope to train their suitable replacements. The average time required for an enemy commander to move from his initial appointment to his ultimate tragedy had shockingly decreased by more than 60% over the preceding 2 turbulent years. A dedicated insurgent commander aggressively operating in Helmand Province suddenly found himself facing a grim statistical life expectancy of absolutely no more than 90 days once his identity was officially verified. Meanwhile, a highly active senior financial facilitator working in the dusty, dangerous streets of Kandahar Province was incredibly lucky to last a mere 45 days before he was permanently removed from the equation. The radical network was being aggressively consumed from the top down, forcing the severely depleted enemy to desperately promote wildly inexperienced junior fighters to senior leadership roles they were completely unprepared to handle. The Americans had successfully engineered a brilliant system where the enemy was forced to rely on their absolute worst, most incompetent personnel simply because all the intelligent leaders had already been systematically neutralized. The invisible machine had brilliantly broken the very concept of natural selection on the battlefield, turning the Taliban's own organizational strengths into their absolute most fatal operational vulnerabilities. However, the true nightmare for the enemy was only just beginning to unfold in the dark as historical ghosts returned to haunt them. When we critically examine the broader historical context of this brutal, decades-long conflict, we must remember that these resilient insurgent fighters had famously defeated the massive Soviet Union in the 1980s. They had stubbornly survived years of relentless conventional warfare, enduring massive artillery barrages, sprawling armored columns, and devastating carpet-bombing campaigns that ultimately broke the back of a global superpower. But the indisputable truth is that those battle-hardened veterans had absolutely never encountered anything even remotely resembling the terrifying, hyper-efficient, intelligence-driven mechanism built by the Joint Special Operations Command. The towering Soviet war machine was a clumsy, highly predictable beast that fought a traditional war over physical territory, relying on overwhelming brute force and massive troop formations to slowly crush its enemies. The new American machine, however, was fighting an entirely invisible war based on electronic signals, unprecedented speed, and absolute psychological domination that the rugged mountain fighters simply could not comprehend or counter. The heavily armed men relentlessly hunting them through the jagged mountains were the direct, terrifying descendants of an earlier generation of shadow warriors who had stalked the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. During the chaotic, bloody height of the Vietnam conflict, the highly classified operatives of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, had struck absolute terror into the hearts of their enemies. Those legendary commandos were famously known by the terrified locals as the men with green faces, moving silently through the dense foliage to execute devastating strikes before vanishing completely without a single physical trace. The modern special operators in Afghanistan had fully inherited this incredibly lethal DNA, but they had aggressively upgraded it with 4-tube panoramic night vision goggles and a massive, multi-billion-dollar industrial intelligence apparatus. They had successfully evolved into the undisputed gods of the jungle for a brand new century, wielding a technologically advanced brand of terror that the original operators could only dream of possessing. This incredibly dark legacy would forever haunt the fragile minds of those who foolishly dared to stand against the relentless, highly optimized American war machine. The defining victory of this massive campaign was absolutely not measured in miles of captured territory, but in the deep, paralyzing terror that permanently infected the fragile minds of the surviving enemy leadership. Every single time the sun dipped below the rugged Afghan horizon, plunging the harsh, unforgiving landscape into total darkness, the surviving insurgent commanders were violently gripped by an inescapable sense of impending doom. They would lie wide awake in their fortified compounds, absolutely terrified to use their encrypted radios, deeply suspicious of their own loyal guards, and entirely consumed by the crippling, suffocating fear of the night sky. Each and every enemy fighter was forced to try and fall asleep with the horrifying thought that the invisible machine might send heavily armed operators crashing through their wooden ceiling right at that very second. And the most chilling, spectacular truth of this entire classified history is that the massive machine absolutely never stopped hunting, and most of the time, those terrified commanders were absolutely right.